And again, please feel free to continue to utilize the chat box to answer those questions. And I'll put those questions in the chat box as well. Well, I say I will, but give me 1 second. I'm trying to work two different texts in my iPad, and that's been a little wonky right now, but I'll just put it in the chat box. All righty, let's get this show on the road. All right, so welcome to Advancing Community Culture Wealth, engaging with asset-based frameworks. My name is Dr. Trevor McCray, and I serve as the postdoc for the center. And so really and truly what my job is to be able to take the information that we are doing within the center and create outreach. And so what does that outreach look like? Really, it kind of runs the gamut, whether that's webinars, it's podcasts, it's conference presentations, whatever that may look like. Instead of us doing the research and it almost being doormatted, what we're doing is taking it a step further and saying, hey, we have this amazing research, but now how can we meet the needs of practitioners and researchers to where this information can be application-based? And so that's the role for me, is to create avenues, I would say, in regards to how do we leverage this information to these stakeholders, I would say, to ensure that this information doesn't just go into a database and is never shared, but how do we create this content to where it's applicable, but also too that these individuals understand the information that's being shared within this particular space. So any given point that I'm sharing something within the presentation and it may be a little too researchy, I would say, please let me know in the comments, and I'll do my best to make sure that I am synthesizing it down to where it's application-based and that you all understand it as well. So as we begin, I do also want to share that being from the South, I can talk a little bit too fast. So I do have my iPad on side of me to let me know if I'm talking too fast or anything. So please feel free to let me know to slow down in the chat box as well. I love engagement, so please feel free at any time to utilize the chat box or raise your hand for us to engage in any additional dialogue. So with that being said, let's dive into some content. Alrighty, so today you all will be able to take away far as the learning outcomes. Basically, hopefully this will enhance your awareness and knowledge of asset-based frameworks and the purpose of the concept. Engage in a virtual community with colleagues to acknowledge the application of asset-based frameworks in hopes that these individuals, hopefully these individual toolkits will be sharp, your individual toolkits will be sharpened. In addition to that, learn about research that has guided our center scholarship and how it can impact functional areas in higher education engaging with communities of color. So I do want to also, before we get into the historical context, I do also want to state that asset-based frameworks are centered around, well, I would say more so centered around communities of color. And so when you think about the interaction and engagement that you all have with students of color, think about the ways in which you, and we'll actually have the engagement piece in a few, but think about the ways in which you engage with your students. Do you think about them from a deficit-based lens, or do you think about them from an asset-based lens? And so I wanted to start off this historical context with kind of giving some historical factors of understanding that we've come to understand that historically, when we think about things, we have been conditioned to thinking about things from this deficit lens. And this is something that has been in relations to communities of color for centuries. In addition to that, scholars have also stated that deficit thinking holds students from historically oppressed populations responsible for these challenges and inequalities that they face. And so they're already playing catch up, or we having to do a multitude of different things based on this historical context. However, when we think about this, and I love when Douglas mentioned this particular quote, he talks about, instead of focusing on what we still lack, we must take stock of what we already do and have in terms of resources, abilities, and pure will. And so when we think about transitioning from a deficit-based lens to a asset-based lens, we have to start thinking about from ourselves, what are the things that we give that are our strengths, that are our abilities, that we offer, that oftentimes that we may feel we put those to the side, or because it's not the dominant capital or dominant form of ways of doing things, we feel as though we minimize a lot of those things because we don't feel that they are important, especially for individuals of color. And so my last piece that I want to also to specify here is that while equity and access efforts shine a light on marginalized and underrepresented communities, some efforts treated schools and communities like they need to be saviors. Sorry for the little mumbo jumbo there. And so when we think about education as a whole, oftentimes when we think about equity and access, we think about this concept of savior. We have to go and save these individuals because of these historical contexts. But have we ever looked at the concept of what do these individuals bring to this particular space that are attributes and can be advantageous to their educational advancement? So I wanted to I wanted to do this deficit approach versus asset-based approach, because I felt as though it was really important for us to really conceptualize how we begin to think about things from a deficit lens, but how can that be transitioned to more of an asset-based lens approach? So I'm going to start on the left side. So for a deficit approach, oftentimes we're focusing on the individual's needs. We're examining the problems. We're observing things from an external lens. And then we're often looking at what's missing of this individual or what's missing from this community. On the other side, when we think about it from an asset-based lens, we start to think about their strengths. We start to think about their opportunities and examining those opportunities. We begin to observe the internal lens. And then in addition to that, we are looking at the things that's present. So what do they currently have? What do they currently possess? And so as you can kind of see the difference here from the deficit-based approach, from the asset-based approach, you kind of begin to think about the deficit-based approach of always having to feel like you're wanting to fix something. And that programming or advising and coaching, you're approaching it from a lens of these individuals don't have these particular skill sets or these things to offer. Whereas if we start looking at things from this asset-based lens, we start looking at when this individual sits down, this individual comes with capabilities, strengths, and abilities that can be very well beneficial to their career endeavors, but also to beneficial to the academic advancement. And so when we start to think about those different things, it's really important to begin looking at what do these individuals bring to the forefront. And that's one of the things that I love about our research and that I'll get into in the later segment of the presentation. But we're looking at those individual assets that those individuals bring to the table instead of focusing so much on a deficit lens. And I always say, when I think about deficit approach, I think about depression. It just really feels icky. And oftentimes it just feels as though the needle is not moving forward because we're focused so much on, in a sense, the negative aspects of this individual. So give me a second. I want to minimize these things so you won't see. But the title states, what are asset-based frameworks? In the simplest terms, asset-based approaches focuses on strengths, abilities, and the potential of an individual. In addition to that, when we think about asset-based frameworks, and rather than us focusing on their needs, deficit, and problems, what we're doing now with asset-based frameworks, we're shifting our mindsets when it pertains to communities of color or students of color, because now we're focusing again more so on their strengths, abilities, and potential, more so than we're focusing on those needs and deficit and problems. And so again, this is kind of more of a simple base term, and I kind of broke this down just concisely, I would say, but I was speaking to a practitioner this morning, and I was just informing him that these frameworks really help you shift your mindset. And so instead of you thinking from this, again, deficit-based framework, now we're starting to think about the asset components of this particular work that we're doing. And so now it's more so, how do we incorporate those voices? And one of the things that, especially as a qualitative researcher, I'm very big on empowering the voices of the community of color, just simply because I think that they're able to share their stories more so than me reading about their stories or looking at data points that share insight about their stories. What are those voices saying? And how can I immerse myself within those voices, not to extract, but more so to understand? And I think that oftentimes when we get into spaces that we're trying to extract from communities of color and students of color, more so than really trying to understand what they bring to the table, who they are, and how can we leverage this information and what they're bringing us. And so again, in the simplest terms, asset-based frameworks truly focuses on the strengths of these individuals and what they bring to the forefront. So one may think, why is this important? Well, for several reasons. It doesn't focus on communities of color inadequacy. This framework offers insight into, again, their talent, strengths, and potential. The goal is to build relationships and understand these students while embracing their uniqueness and what they bring to the forefront. And lastly, it's more accurate when you think about this asset-based framework, it's more accurate to introduce a young person by their aspirations and contributions before mentioning their challenges than it is to sum them up as at risk. And I think oftentimes, especially within education, we utilize at risk often. And we also don't think about the power of language and how at risk is already from a deficit lens. And so as you are hypothetically, let's say you're being introduced once by someone, you want them to introduce your qualities, your attributes, and the things that you are known for in a positive light. And you don't want them to be in a space where they're introducing all of the challenges and problems that you went through. To me, I think that if someone's introducing me that way, they are seeking for those individuals to have pity for me. And those individuals are never going to look at me from an asset-based lens as if I'm worth something. And so again, it's important when we think about this particular work that we're introducing these individuals of color within the aspiration and contribution, regardless of historically what has transpired. Again, those things do matter, but we do want to focus on what do they bring culturally, and that is really rich in understanding of who they are, but also too the skill sets that they've produced culturally as well. That's really important. That oftentimes, if it's not on par of the dominant narrative, it doesn't mean that it's not important either. Because again, it's still important, but again, we have to start looking at it as equal and not looking at it as this is where we're trying to get them to. And when I say get them to, we're not trying to get them to this European way of seeing things. What we're trying to do is elevate who they are culturally and who they are as an individual without minimizing those attributes. So, question for you all, and you can, this is an area for you to chime in via chat box, or you can raise your hand and we can definitely engage in dialogue verbally. But I want to ask, when working with your communities of color, how do you usually assess their work? And two, do you find that your approach is more need-based or is it affirming? So I'll give you all a few minutes to think about that, and I will take one or two engagement answers verbally or in the chat box. I'm going to assume from the silence here, we're thinking really, really hard. So I'll give you all a few more minutes to engage in some thoughts, but then also too, if anyone wants to share. If not, we will move on. really love that answer, Jasmine, and I'm going to read it for everyone else. My goal is to allow for my community to recognize the power that they have and to empower them to utilize their power to create the changes they seek. And I really love that answer, just because I think that when we give power to these individuals and we're empowering them, it really can change the transition and narrative of who these individuals are. Most importantly, I think that one of the biggest things is that uh, when we think about the work that we're doing from an asset-based lens, how do we give power in that particular space? And what does that power look like? And I think, again, changing that narrative from this dominant form of power to this more equal based level power that still affirms them within the work that they're doing. Matthew states, usually I meet them where they are, meaning the skills and strengths they come with, but also in the assessment, if challenges or insecurities are prevalent, I meet them as well as a parameter to improve. Matthew, I really love that. And actually, it's really great that you put that particular piece because I have something at the end that I definitely think will be very thought provoking and challenging for that same, meeting them where they are. But I definitely think that this is important too. When we talk about the challenges and insecurities, not saying that, again, we are minimizing these particular things, because again, I think we do have to address them, but we're not focusing so much on them. So I think that's a really big piece as well, Matthew, that you bring up, is still addressing them within the assessment piece, but obviously, still focusing on the strengths and skill sets that they bring. Jamie, hopefully I'm saying your name correctly, and this will be the last one that I answer, but bring to the forefront. But again, please feel free to continue to insert in the chat box. Again, this is a virtual community that I definitely want you all to engage. I am kind of stumped because I am currently on learning how I assess the work of my student workers. It takes some time for me to understand who they are first and see their skills. So after some time, I would assess differently for each student worker. Jamie, I think this is a really great concept. Very vulnerable thought here. And one of the things that I definitely would say is that I think with the engagement of conversation is definitely really great. I think oftentimes when we, coming into work, you're trying to learn the daily operations, and sometimes, you already have a system in which it's already it's a well-oiled machine, and I would say. And so oftentimes, especially for students of color, they're kind of coming in trying to see where they fit, but also to just really maybe trying to stay under the radar and just kind of learn what they need to do and leave. And so I definitely think engaging in conversations and learning more for them in their strengths, and then being able to place them in places within the well-oiled machine, I would say, that speaks to the attributes and skill sets that they already possess. So hopefully that kind of gives you some insight into maybe how you can maneuver and work with that, instead of maybe just kind of focusing on, as they're learning the work, you're learning their skill sets within that particular space. So I definitely think, as cliche as it may sound, those one-on-ones are really important, because I think that's the space where you begin to learn and hear the narratives of those individuals. Really, really great pieces, really, really great. And again, if you want to continue dialogue, please feel free to insert those answers within the chat box. Again, that first question stated, when working with your communities of color, how do you usually assess their work? And two, do you find that your approach is more need-based or affirming? All righty, so building your toolkit. So I felt it was important also to provide different resources for you all, that you all can begin to look into, maybe for as frameworks or just additional resources and where you can go. And so these are just some frameworks in which we've kind of definitely engaged with within our office. One being funds of knowledge, community of color, community culture of Jesus, analysis of capital, engineering funds of knowledge, and the anti-deficit achievement framework. And so just far as just kind of like a simplistic breakdown of funds of knowledge. Funds of knowledge basically say historically, it hones in on the knowledge and skills that exist within their culture, that allows them to function within their day-to-day well-being. When we think about community culture wealth, and I'll engage in that a little bit more, but instead of us kind of focusing on the two dominant based forms of capital, we begin to look at the various forms of capital and how that impacts the way in which they really navigate life, and the things that they pull from within these different capitals that really allows them to, advance in life, whether that's academically, career, whatever that may be, is something that's empowering them within their forms of capital that they possess. That oftentimes I think we don't really focus on those different forms of capital, but we'll get more in depth into that in a few. When we think about engineering funds of capital, this kind of, I would say, piggybacks off funds of capital, but in this respect, I mean, I guess in this space, what it does is it focuses more so on the expertise and assets of engineering and the things that they may bring from that particular space when it comes to the knowledge and skill sets that they already possess. When we think about the analysis of capital, what it does is it extends Marxian logic capital by expanding wider views than just economic accumulation. In addition to that, it also expands forms of capital that carry various market values. And so really empowering and understanding the various dimensions of capital and how we look at it beyond just the economic accumulation. And then from our anti-deficit achievement framework by Sean Harper, one of the things I love about this is that he provides researchers different ways in which we can focus on asking questions. And so one of the things my mom always said, when you ask the question in a different way, you get a different answer. And so from an anti-deficit lens, sometimes, and I'll have a few questions at the end that we can kind of engage in this work. But if you ask a very simplistic, maybe deficit-based framework, deficit-based question, you may get more of a deficit-based answer. And so when you're asking more of an anti-deficit-based question, you may begin to, again, kind of more so move from this deficit response to more so of an asset-based framework response. Whereas you may have a little bit of deficit there, but they are not focused so much on that particular piece. They're focusing more so on the asset lens. In addition to that, some additional skills that you can look into, the asset-based thinking website was a really great website. I think that this also too really challenges us as we begin to do this work and dive more into this work of also understanding asset-based research for ourselves. And so that was one particular way in which I like that particular research because it's more internal. And I think honestly, and this is not trying to change anyone's mindset or thoughts, but I think in order for us to truly be able to do this work, I think we also have to engage in the work as well. In addition to that, shameless plug, the Center for Research on College and Workforce Transition, which is us, we also offer additional research and different things within our office that is more so from an asset-based lens as well that you all can tap into and utilize at anytime that you would need any assistance when it comes to this particular work. And so I definitely think that it would be a really great opportunity to engage with our services to really understand how you can implement them on your campus. So as I'm talking about our current our research in the center, I wanted to highlight two areas and two research things that we've been working on, and one being our network culture and asset team, which looks at the social network of students and utilize community cultural wealth. And how this impacts their career development, also to influence it as well. And so we really have some really great research focusing on our Hispanic and Latina communities, Latinx communities, that I really think will be really great to really reference and leverage, especially in career services. But I think also too, even if you do career services within your own respective areas, maybe on the academic side or the student services side, I definitely think this would be really great to really engage in and really think about the ways in which this research is important. And then on the other end, one of the things that I really found very interesting was one of our co-directors researches where he's rethinking soft skills and student employability, a new paradigm for undergraduate education. And I think that this is really great, and we'll kind of get more into that particular space as well. And paradigm is just more so in the ways in which we look at things. and really being able to transform the way in which we look at things. So when we think about the community cultural wealth, it basically describes the assets of communities of color, which derives from their families, cultures, languages, and communities of origin. These assets help them navigate spaces that were not designed with them in mind. And so the community cultural wealth frameworks includes 7 capitals, one being linguistic capital, familiar capital, social capital, spiritual capital, navigational capital, resistant capital, and aspirational capital. So a breakdown of these forms of capital, cultural capital is basically an individual that is able to maintain hope and dreams despite any barriers that they may particularly face. When we think about linguistic capital, this is just different forms of communication within those individuals' culture, whether that's storytelling, that's art, that's music, different forms of languages speak to them in different ways. When we think about familiar capital, those things that are akin to them, whether that's history, that's memories, or that's cultural intuition, those things empower them. And those are things that as they navigate their journeys, they begin to think about the things that's familiar to them, or they grasp the things that's familiar to them because it may become more of a comfort zone piece for them. When we think about social capital, obviously that's your networks, the people, the community, and resources that you're surrounded by. Your navigational capital, this is basically intuition of maneuvering through social institutions. Obviously, again, for things that maybe in spaces that were not created for them. In addition to that, you have resistant capital. And so this is just basically a behavior, the opposition of behavior that challenges inequalities. And so basically just kind of taking that stance and just being really determined in that particular space to oppose those dominant narratives and the inequalities that they may face. And last but not least, spiritual capital came a little bit later. Tara Yoso, this community cultural wealth is derived from Tara Yoso. And she's been a really great asset to this particular space. And this derived in 2005. Later on, maybe in 2010, spiritual capital came, where this form of capital or this framework was enhanced to include spiritual capital and the importance of spirituality within these communities, and is rooted in the spiritual connections and how this actually empowers those individuals as they're navigating as well. As they're navigating life as well. And so this was a really important piece that I wanted to break down, because I think the ways in which we use, again, community cultural wealth is to really understand the social networks and career influences and career development of these individuals, specifically Hispanic and Latino population. But I definitely think that this would definitely be a framework that can be used for various forms of communities of color. Because it really empowers and really helps you understand the holistic forms of capital that these individuals bring into this space that oftentimes are typically not tapped into. When I think about some of the things, and I also have 6+ years within career services. So when I think about the ways in which we may look at forms of capital, are we truly looking at forms of capital from an asset-based lens? When we think about networking programs, and I'll kind of talk about this a little bit later, but when we think about networking programs, are we looking at networking for students of color to communities of color from a asset lens, or are we looking at it from a deficit-based lens? I think a really big piece is also too that we often don't talk about is when we think about cover letters and we begin to share, these cover letters need to come from, these particular individuals, or these references need to come from these individuals, how we are minimizing the network that they already have. Because oftentimes their network is typically included, it includes individuals that are from their communities, maybe family, friends, extended family, things of that nature. But what we say is that you need a professor, you need a previous supervisor. We're telling them everything outside of the social network that they already have. And from our research, and Nydia, please correct me if I'm wrong, I think you mentioned 40% of the students mentioned within our Whitewater data that 40% of their social network was family and friends. And so I think that number is, is, even though it's not half, I think that's still a large percentage of our students that, especially our students of color, that rely on their social network within their family and friends structure. And so it's really important for us to also think about the ways in which we display this information, because it could be minimizing the capital that these individuals bring. So transitioning to our next set of research that we have in the office, when we talk about soft skills, okay, yes, so Nydia corrected that, it's 45%. So just about half. So it's really great just to see, what do their networks possess? I mean, who are in their networks and who predominantly is, I would say, who's predominantly being shown within that particular space. And again, it's family and friends. And so as we transition to another sector of our research, one of the things that I loved about this particular research is that it really challenges the way in which we understand soft skills. And it really, for me, growing in the career services space, we talk about soft skills and technical skills, or some people may call it power skills or different things of that nature. It really challenged me to start thinking about, in what ways do we really understand soft skills, that soft skills paradigm versus a cultural capital paradigm? And a few things that really just stood out to me when it came to the challenging of soft skills paradigm is that teaching culturally relevant pedagogy is often overlooked. In addition to that, soft skills are seen as elementary and simple, assuming that students will internalize these skills within classes or workshops. In addition to that, students are responsible for acquiring these short-term skills. And one of the things when I thought about it from a resume standpoint, oftentimes when it comes to soft skills, I personally, prior to, would tell students, focus more so on technical skills. Soft skills are things that you just acquire over time. But also too, not understanding how they're also added to me, a more of a deficit-based framework. And I had to challenge myself on this, because how do I know those individuals may gain this throughout the time if they may just be going to classes or workshops without taking the time to say, these may be soft skills that you have gained, or culturally relevant skills that you've gained through your culture, that I have not taken the time to sit down and say, hey, let's sit down and think about the things that you have acquired and that you do have, that are skills that maybe I'm not bringing awareness to, or that I haven't thought about because I haven't taken the time as the individual that's teaching and coaching them. I haven't taken the time to really figure out what they've been doing because I've minimized it for so long. And again, I think the end of the day, one of the biggest things when it comes to research, it really challenges your mind, challenges your thought process. And so it really pushed me to begin to think about, in what ways culturally do I begin to think about these individual skill sets, and how do I bring life to those skill sets for those individuals? And so on the other end, the argument now is that we have to start thinking about things from a cultural capital paradigm instead of from a soft skills paradigm. We have to think about skills are based on the assignment of values and context, not on simple or difficult. In addition to that, we promote the idea that knowledge and aptitudes are acquired as young people are immersed in specific settings. Lastly, students' interests are met through the intentional investment of affinity-based social and cultural capital. And so when I began to think about this, I'm also understanding, I think we had a few Texas folks on here as well. And we may, obviously thinking about just this landscape of banning diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that comes with banning languages, the ways in which we speak in pedagogy. So I thought about that in regards to how do you begin to do this culturally capital, I would say, how do you begin to think from this cultural capital perspective without breaking, I would say, the law at this point. And so I think the biggest thing is, how do we assign values to particular skills? And what does that look like? How do these individuals gain this particular knowledge, obviously without overstepping, laws and different things of that nature? But on the other end, even if you're not in a particular state where that you're dealing with it, how are we assigning those values to those particular skills? Do we minimize the value of certain skills? Do we provide more weight on certain skills more than others? For me, I provided more weight on technical skills because I felt as though that was more important. Whereas technical skills, yes, they may be important for the job, but are we just preparing them for a short-term labor market and really not providing or honing in on those particular skill set that can really be advantageous and oftentimes I say multidimensional for these particular students that's going into the workforce. One thing I also too want to leverage before we move on from this slide is that immersing individual in specific settings to help them gain the particular skill sets that we want them to gain. How many spaces are we creating? When we think about internships, or I know it's a conversation on internships should be paid, and it should be banned for unpaid internships. But are we just truly focusing on internships for those students to gain that particular experience? Or are we just focusing on faculty members to create this in-class experience that we feel that they should be gaining, but are we truly do we truly know if they're gaining it? Because are these individuals teaching maybe from a culturally relevant, I would say from a culturally relevant pedagogy? In what ways are we teaching this particular thing? Or in what ways are we teaching these skill sets that really help these individuals immerse into that particular skill? Also too, I'm an avid advocate, I would say, for co-curriculum activities and being involved on campuses. But the more I engage with practitioners in the field, I'm really challenging myself to really think about our skill sets being gained in those particular areas. And what will it take for those individuals to gain those particular skills in that area as they are navigating that particular space of being involved? Because if every organization offers something different, and the ways in which it's being taught in those organizations can, be different as well. And it's not necessarily that it's from a culturally relevant lens as well in those spaces as well. So it just really gets me to begin to think about the ways in which my paradigm is shifting and how I begin to think about these things, because I'm gonna be honest, this particular thing really stumped and challenged me as a career service practitioner, because oftentimes I feel as though I failed into the soft skills paradigm, and I didn't create avenues for communities of color to think about the cultural capital paradigm. So I'm sure this is probably something that you're constantly thinking about as well, or you're thinking about now in the ways in which you do your work. And so I would love to engage at the end. I'm also going to leave space at the end for us to engage as well, to really just think about this particular form, this paradigm shift, but then also too the ways in which we think about community culture wealth and different forms of capital that our students may possess. So oftentimes when we do this research, we do research presentations. It's really great to share the information, but now how do we start thinking about the application piece? And so it's really important for me, as I would say I'm a researcher / practitioner, for me to really understand, as I'm engaging with practitioners and researchers, how do I begin to think about this from an application standpoint? And so as I mentioned earlier from Sean Hopper's piece, when we think about forming questions, so instead of us asking, why do so few students of color lack engagement with their career services department in college, maybe reframing it and asking, how were career aspirations cultivated amongst undergraduate students of color who are currently enrolled? And so I think by changing in the ways in which, again, that language, changing in the ways in which we ask that question, I think you get a different answer. And so again, as I go to what my mom said, if you, based on the question that you ask, that's the answer that you're going to get. And so she said in quite a few different ways, but the undertone of what she said was the same. I think the ways in which we ask the question is going to be based off the ways in which we engage within the answer from that individual. In addition to that, when we think about programming and advising, I think instead of us starting from a need-based perspective, maybe focusing specifically when we think about networking programs and panels and just different things of that nature, are we looking at this from a European way, or are we looking at this from a multidimensional way? Are we looking at it from a multidimensional lens? And so I was actually giving a presentation to one of our departments on campus, and I was referring to when we think about networking, as a person of color, specifically a Black man, networking is probably one of the most frightening things for me per se, and maybe for other Black males as well, especially me being an introvert. And so oftentimes in those networking spaces, it doesn't feel organic, it feels forced. But changing that narrative of thinking for me, in what ways do I network that feel comfortable for me in my particular culture? That may be I'm networking at the barbershop, and I don't think it's just an ingrained thing that I do. When we go to the barbershop, that's our community. That's a safe haven for us. We're having conversations, we're engaging in a multitude of different topics, and that's a form of networking. Now, someone else may look at that as just this has no relevance or this is not important, but to someone like me, that may be my form of networking. And that I think we have to begin to think about in ways, and what other ways can we be creative when it comes to these forms of programming ways? Well, in what ways can we be, I would say, more culturally relevant when it comes to these programming models? And I'm saying just networking and panels and just different things, but it runs the gamut. I think we have to begin to think about obviously not only we're engaging in this networking topic, but are we looking at it from a multi-dimensional level that begins to be an asset to these individuals that we're impacting? I'm gonna be honest, the diversity, equity, and inclusion conference of networking thing is the one size fit all model. Yes, it may be great, but it's not a one size fit all model again. And oftentimes because you're bringing well-known individuals into this space, or professional individuals into this space, we also have to understand that these individuals may or may not carry their cultural identity on them at all times in this particular space. And so begin to think about the ways in which this can also be detrimental to those individuals that we're trying to impact, even if we think the intent is important. When we think about advising as well, I think it's important for us not to come into the space of these individuals may have to learn how to even develop or create a resume or a cover letter. Really maybe asking the questions of how do you even understand those particular things? What are the skill sets that you have that you feel you can put on those particular things? And also to demystifying the ways in which these individuals may look at these particular documents or just different things in which you're coaching. I think is really going to be really great. I know obviously with assessments or career assessments, it's really important for us to look at that to see what those individuals may possess from that particular lens. But also thinking about it, we can't just stop at the assessments, because the assessments may have been created from a European lens. And so, yes, although it may be great to help and assist you, one of the biggest things is you also don't want to minimize the cultural relevance and the cultural things that they may bring to the forefront that's not identified within that particular space as well on those assessments. So that's just a thing that I want you all to think about. In addition to this, and this is one of the things I love from the community cultural wealth aspect in our NCEA team, networking cultural assets, accentuating language when it comes to communities of color. So instead of us stating underrepresented students in texts or speeches, maybe reframing and stating rising scholars or champions. And so again, bringing power to this power in language. And so the ways in which we describe these individuals is often going to be the ways in which they interpret and see themselves. And oftentimes, especially when we think about career services specifically, and we ask ourselves why these individuals may not be coming into this space, we also have to think about the language in which we're displaying as well. What are our actions and how are we displaying that within the conversations that we're having in the times that they are meeting us, or that they are seeing us and we want them to utilize our services. So there's different ways in which I think, and obviously I think it's creating a language. I wouldn't say creating a language. Well, I would say it. Creating maybe like a language Excel spreadsheet that could potentially be helpful for individuals to begin to think about different languages that they could potentially use that shifts the mind from a deficit lens to more of an asset-based lens. And that could be something I think that I can bring back to our team to see if that's something that we can create as a resource for our stakeholders. And so now I want to open the floor up for you all, and I don't want to take up too much time. And know I mentioned 45 minutes, but Matthew, you brought up the, I would say the cliche higher education phrase, meeting students where they are. And so I have 3 questions for you all that I want you all to think about, but also engage with. How do we truly know where students of color are? How do we approach this phrase from a deficit lens? And lastly, how could we acknowledge where students are without meeting them where they are? So I'll give you some time to think about those questions, and then we'll open the floor. Matthew, you definitely could take yourself off of mute and speak aloud. Yeah, so if you would like to speak out loud, you definitely can. If not, you definitely can utilize the chat box as well. We love the silence. And I do also know that it's right after lunch, so Matthew or someone.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Sure. Good evening, everyone, and Dr. McCray, thank you for the presentation. For me, for your first question, how do we truly know where students of color are? For me, it's through the one-on-one genuine conversations. So it's gauging where they're demographically from, maybe asking what type of school they went to, maybe asking questions, what are their hobbies? What do they tend to lean into more? What do they tend to watch? Maybe some of their, if I'm meeting a student academically, it's asking them what are their habits of studying, what are some of their practices. So with some of those things that I'm asking open-ended questions is how do I truly get to know where a student is? And from there, I get to gauge where not really from a deficit lens, but it's more so this is where I can help you improve. So let's say that after failing a couple tests, and I ask her, what do you think the challenges are? What do you see some of the trends are? And then it may show up that they never learned how to study because they were the top in their class and never really had to study. So it lets me know, well, I need to maybe take you to the academic tutoring area to get just a basic framework of what does studying really look like. I know for me as a person of color, I was the top 10 in my class. So when it actually got to college, I didn't really have to learn read textbooks. So reading was a deficit for me. So I had to actually learn how to strategically take notes in a chapter book or whatnot to be able to do that. So, but it was through one-on-one conversations where I was able to be reflective and see what my strengths were, which I knew being repeating information or public speaking, or because I did acting. So for me, regurgitating the information as if I was acting was how I retained it, but you can't do that for a whole chapter, right? So essentially having to couple that with even learning how to dissect a chapter was beneficial for me. So it was through those one-on-one conversations of someone asking open-ended questions to see where a student was.
Okay. Thank you, Matthew. I think that was really great. And I love the way in which you were able to leverage your own, I would say, narrative in regards to how you approach and navigate, meeting students where they are. Because I think, as I mentioned earlier, really immersing yourself in your own story and your narrative really can help you when it comes to the asset-based lens, because you knew what it took for you. And so obviously, that obviously in a sense, being able to go that extra mile and really meeting students where they are. And sometimes it may mean meeting students where they are and taking them somewhere and doing different things that can really help them advance within their particular career, within their academics. And so Brother Miles is actually my friend brother, but Matthew, thank you for that in regards to being able to leverage your own narrative and, what drives you to meet students where they are. Any other thoughts? I know we have Jasmine mentioned to know where students of color are. We have to ask them. We have to be in conversations with those that we hope to serve. Otherwise, we'll continue to fail them. Really, really great point, Jasmine. I really love that. I think the really big piece here is that we have to ask questions and we have to engage in conversation with these individuals, and not from a more so of a extracting stance, but more so just really of an understanding base, and really intentionally investing into those individuals. So Jasmine, thank you for that. Dr. Hayes, I see that you have your hand raised. We're open the floor for you to speak, so please feel free to take yourself off of mute.
Hi, good afternoon. Once again, my name is Dr. Olivia Hayes, and I currently serve as a career development specialist here at the University of Houston. Dr. McCray, it's lovely to see you. I'm very proud of you. This was an awesome presentation, so I'm very, very proud of you. And so honestly, to answer your question, I could go all day about this topic. But most importantly, we have to go find our students. We have to go and meet them where they are, literally. That's what it is. We have to go meet them where they are. But in the case of how do we know where our students of color, is and are, it's simply what it is. We have to go and meet them where they are. And just based on my perspective and identifying as a woman of color, that's what I look for when I come to campuses. I look for my students of color. I'm very intentional about my practice. But I definitely want to go find our students of color, because if they don't see us, then how are they going to know that we're there? And so I don't have a problem with going to get my hands dirty, going to figure out where the students are, meeting them where they are. And so I can even let you know from the perspective of us in our office with career services, something that we're doing a little bit different is, for example, during our Prepare for the Fair week, we have now changed our practice to go to the students to meet them where they are. So for example, we can sit here and say a traditional Prepare for the Fair week is we'll have workshops, we'll have all these things. And we even have a workshop where we focus on specifically international students. And so what we've done is we are literally taking this and we're going, for example, to the student center to actually be there to find these students to participate in our workshops. And so we're making it a little bit more fun. We're making it a little bit more personal. Trevor, you know me, I'm very authentic. So we're making this authentic. We're making it authentic. And we're trying to let these students know that aside from you being who you are, you can still show up and be who you are, because we're going to be who we are. So we have created a space for our students that no matter a title, and just to share with you where I am in the state of Texas, where my office, my institution, we are affected by the Senate bill, the legislation, everything that has come out. And so we've kind of had to sit down and reimagine our practice and some of the things that we can and cannot say. And so we're not removing anything. We're just making it us. We're just making it us. But most importantly, we're trying to make it to where the students can still have an authentic space to come. We're still going to be authentically ourselves. But I definitely think that what we're doing is we're going to find these students, but we're doing research as well to identify these students, right? So if they're coming to orientation, guess what? If you're a student of color, I'm looking for you. I'm talking to you. And so we're just making our practice a little bit more intentional to go and find these students of color and really, really show them that not only are you here, but you also have someone that looks like you have someone that believes in you, but most importantly, in terms of being a person of color, we identify that as well. So that's kind of a little bit of what I'm doing, but as well as what we're doing as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hayes, for that. And also, I'll put it in the chat box if you do need to leave based on time. Please feel free to do so. A survey should pop up on your screen after. Please feel free to complete that survey. and let us know how we did, but also to how we can improve. But then also for us to collect data on as well. Obviously, we need those things. But Dr. Hayes, I think that was really great when you talk about meeting them physically where they are, and taking that time to really immerse yourselves within their spaces. And again, I use this word not to extract. As I've engaged in multiple forms of research, and I think when it comes to students of color and communities of color, oftentimes we are extracting information from them more so than really just immersing ourselves within that particular space. Learning what we can, asking the questions that we need, but taking the information and being able to apply it in an intentional way that's going to be advantageous for those communities. And so I really just want to engage in that conversation on meeting students where they are. I know it's often a cliche term that we use in higher education in a multitude of different functional areas. But really truly understanding what does this term mean and how are we really applying this particular piece, especially when we think about it from an asset versus deficit lens. And so I think taking this question and utilizing the accent within your office and really just seeing, people's perspectives, and not saying to challenge their perspective, but, more so maybe creating a space of engagement and learning that I definitely think will help individuals begin to look at these, different terms in which are cliche phrases that we use on a daily basis, and really, extracting and understanding what are we saying and where are we going with this particular phrase, and are we looking at it from a deficit lens or asset-based lens? So I think these are just some different ways in which we can begin applying this information in our day-to-day work. So as I end the presentation, I just kind of, yikes, I got a little handsy with my animation. I do want to end with just some wrap-ups and takeaways. So hopefully, one of the things that I want you all to remember and to take away from this is engage with your communities of color to learn more about what they know and what they can do. Offer different learning platforms for your population of students, especially for our students of color. They may learn in different ways through different forms. I would say different learning platforms or in different environments in different spaces. And so how can we offer those different platforms? And, hopefully it's something that we don't have to spend a lot of money on. I know in higher ed, we're always thinking about funding and it's always a topic. But, in what ways can we do these things without it extracting a huge barrier that could potentially offset how we engage with these populations of students? In addition to that, when it comes to advising and coaching, focus on what they did well and how their strengths can address their areas of growth. I definitely think that this is one of the biggest things that we can do when it comes to advising and coaching, whether that's on the career services side, academic side. It's really important for us to focus on what they did well and, being able to say, hey, your strengths in this particular area can help you in this particular area that you may feel you're not growing in or that you have an area you want to grow in more. Specifically, just for example, one of the things I used to do in my mock interviews, and before I gave feedback, I would ask that individual, what did they feel they did well? What are the areas that they feel that they can grow in? And giving power to them to be able to really kind of evaluate themselves first before anyone else evaluated them, because I felt as though it was important to give power to who they were and their voices. In addition to this, last but not least, utilizing these frameworks, affirm underutilized and untapped talent. And that is the biggest thing that we want to do when it comes to communities of color. How do we tap into those particular spaces? How do we affirm those spaces? But more importantly, how do we bring those to the forefront to really help them engage within this work? And so hopefully this short presentation, I would say more of an hour-ish presentation, was able to engage you enough to really think about the ways in which we think about asset-based frameworks, but also too in the ways in which you can utilize them within your particular space. And so I do want to thank you all for taking this time throughout your day virtually to spend with me, to learn more about this particular concept and framework, but then more importantly, in ways in which you can engage with our office to kind of carry this conversation more. Also, our resources are for you in any ways that we can meet you where you are. We're definitely willing to do that. I do host one-on-ones. So if there's ever a time or something that you saw in the presentation that you want to delve more into, please feel free to send me an email. and we can schedule maybe a one-on-one to kind of talk more about this and, maybe talk about ways in which you can apply this within the work that you do. So I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to open the floor if you all have any additional conversations or pieces that you want to share, or thought-provoking things that, came to mind. I'm going to open the floor for you all to speak now. And again, when you do log out, we do have a survey for you to fill out. So please feel free to fill that out for me. Again, we are collecting data on this within our presentation, so it'd be really great to continue to grow and learn from you all as well within the content that you're leaving.